Welcome to another Tech Stuff Tuesday. This week, I'm going to restore and rebuild this MA Audio MA103XE. There are a few different versions of it that look kind of similar. They changed the basket, they kind of changed this motor boot. Yes, this just goes over the motor. It doesn't actually have a motor that size. This is all cosmetic, it's a much smaller motor under it. But they changed the surround on it a little bit. The spiders, I believe, are the same. The basket they changed up a little bit. The dust cap they changed, and I can tell I've already broken this down so I could get the part dimensions to get the parts to rebuild this, but it came to me together. But there are a few differences with basically the same model. It starts in MA103, then it's probably going to be the same across all of them. But as you can tell, this coil was pretty crispy. This was not rated for a whole lot of power. I don't remember what it was rated for, but it wasn't a ton and it met its match. So we are actually going to improve this. We're going to put this coil in its place. Nice, shiny new. Have a little bit more X-Max on it, as you can tell from there. Spider-wise, we're going to change the way they're done. Instead of being woven through, which didn't seem to be problematic on this anyway, we're going to be woven on top. This is a very similar spider in terms of compliance and that kind of thing, so mechanically we shouldn't see any change in power handling, but coil wise we should have a little bit more power handling, and the temperature rating on this coil is a little bit higher, so thermally it should handle it better. Mechanically it should be no different, use the same box, and spec wise should have a little bit lower FS from the greater mass on this coil, but stiffness being similar. So overall, this should actually sound a little bit better, but we're going to ultimately use this dust cap and make it look as close as possible as it did originally. One other change that is going to be made is these terminal blocks. Now, I've done another one that was a little bit different. Uses the same coil, we'll use the same suspension, the same cone. It had a little bit different terminal block there, and these things are awful to try to get the solder back to. So we're going to eliminate them, and also you don't need extra tools just to connect your speaker wire. So we're going to get rid of these as well. So step number one is make sure you're subscribed, and also check out the playlist of all the other sub builds that I've done in the past. Step two is going to be getting these terminal blocks loose and cleaning up this basket. I'll spare the boredom that is cleaning up this basket, but something that's notable is these are what I use, is flat discs on a grinder. It's not going to go completely through the basket to where it's going to leave massive indentions and then you should just lay on it, but it does clean it up very nicely. Takes off very easily for both the spider and the surround. Now, another thing to note on this one in particular that is a little bit different than some other speakers is this one is a steel basket, which means it will generate sparks. So sparks are basically hot flying metal. Be aware of your surroundings when you do that. You also want to make sure that you cover up the pole, because those metal pieces that are fine and coming off of it will actually stick to the pole right here. So we got to make sure that this is covered up nice and good, because we definitely don't want to get down in here, because getting it back out will be very, very difficult. If this were an aluminum basket, you wouldn't get the sparks. You may get the fine dust, but you generally don't. It's pretty soft metal. But even so, any dirt that comes down here while you're grinding this off, you peel the tape off, it comes right with it. With the steel basket, it's a little bit different. It will adhere to this and you can peel the tape off. You just got to be a little bit more careful with all that. And I do like to run a vacuum and get as much as I can off the tape before pulling that off. So that's just something to note if you have a steel basket. So off camera, I'm going to get this all cleaned up and then we'll come right back to the actual build. All right, we have got the basket clean. I went ahead and changed out these terminals. You want to do that before you get everything together. It's just way easier that way. There's just a screw on top with these. Sometimes there's a nut that goes on it. It'll be different depending on the terminal that you're using, or you probably aren't even changing these things out. But in this case we are. I just went ahead and did it. Pretty self-explanatory. If you can't get that far, maybe you shouldn't be doing the rest of this. We know the coil that has to go in here because we already figured that out. That's a whole separate video. But from this, we know I've already marked on here where it should be at the top plate. We've measured the top plate. We know the thickness. You go from the center of the coil and add the top plate thickness, or half of it, to where that would be sitting on top. And there are cases where you can look through a basket vent, something like that, and see where it's at the top of the top plate. That's great. We can't do that on this sub though. Everything is blocked off. But here's what we can do. We can put a shim in here and we can move the coil down to this mark. So we're going to take our shim that we know is the right thickness. This is just printer paper, as many sheets as you need to make sure it's nice and snug. But we're going to take the coil, we're going to slide this down in here so it's nice and snug. It'll stay there on its own. We'll move it down to where the line is at the top of the top plate, and you'll happen to notice I've already got a line right there on the piece of paper. It's because I've already done one of these. So what we're doing is effectively putting the coil, marking on the paper. So now we know the top of the former goes to the paper. When we get the spider on everything else, we'll just slide this down to where the shim that's going to be pushed all the way down to the bottom of the motor. The top of this goes to the line. We know it's in the right spot. Everything is properly aligned. So that being said, we can now take our spider, slide it over, which this happens to slide on perfectly. You may or may not have to grind out a little bit of the inside of the spider if it doesn't go on smooth. You do want it to slide easy enough to where it's not binding up, so when you go to slide this up and down, it won't make it go sideways, which it shouldn't because you have the shim. But if you have just a little bit of play in it, that's the ideal scenario. So we're going to get our shim back in here, get the coil back in place. And we're going to push the spider all the way down. So when we push down on the coil, this is going to keep where it needs to be on the basket, perfectly straight. Our shim is going to keep the coil straight. Everything's going to be exactly aligned how we need it from this point. We're down to our mark, and you don't have to have your leads lined up with your terminals at this point, so don't worry about making sure that that is the same or not. But where we are now, we want to make sure we've got these leads out of the way so we can glue the former to the spider. Now, we're not going to go crazy with the amount of glue right now. We do still have a cone that's going to go on top of this. On some instances, you might have a little bit of a gap, or it might be perfectly there. If you did everything correctly, you shouldn't have to pull the surround down to the basket, at least not a whole lot. But with where this is, we're just going to put a little bit of glue all the way in here to make sure that this stays in place. And one thing you can do, not necessarily required, but if you take a pick tool or a paper clip or something like that to get under these leads, just kind of spread it out and make sure you've got a nice even bead all the way around. But particularly get under these leads. Got a nice smooth clean bead all the way around, and we're going to use our accelerator to get that firmed up. I get asked all the time, what is this stuff? This is an activator or an accelerator for CA glue. This is rubberized C glue. That's the accelerator. This goes on first. It's the whole strength, the bonding of it. This just makes it here, not completely, but workable basically instantly. So with all this in place, we can put the cone on. Sometimes you might want to fool with it by taking this completely out because, again, everything's in place where it needs to be. And it might be easier if you're trying to fool with leads and that kind of thing. But something to remember is, one, you want to make sure that these leads are now lined up with your binding posts. But also, if you have notches in the surround, you want to make sure that they're lined up with the holes. So if you have one that does not have these notches, or even if you do, you can kind of get it on there and get it pretty straight. But if you have the notches, you've got to make sure that it lines up. If you don't have notches, it doesn't really matter. You can kind of set it on there, twist around as you need it to, won't make a difference. But in this case, we do have things we do need to line up. So I'm going to leave this all in place. Okay, and there we have it. All the leads pop up right through the notches that were already in this cone. Not every cone has that, but this one had it, so that's nice and convenient. I've twisted around so everything lines up here. So now we need to solder the leads. We want to do that before we glue it. One, so we can go back and make sure that we have the correct lead length on the bottom side because we don't want those to pull out. But also, if it's partially glued, you can get away with soldering it. If you completely glue it, you may not be able to move it around to actually solder everything in. So we're going to solder it in. Now this one, the leads come up pretty high, as you can see on here. If you need to cut this back, the paper itself, right next to it and pull it down, you can do that. I don't see a need to do that. So I'm just gonna fold it down, wrap it around there because it's not that much wire, but sometimes it's way up there and you have to do that. You don't need giant globs of solder over all of this. It just needs to make contact, make sure you get the lead hot enough on both sides of it. And solder should go right through, a good connection. Again, you don't need enormous amounts of solder covering the entire thing. So all these are soldered nice and good. We have a little bit of end that we don't have to cut off. You could trim this out if you wanted to, but ultimately it's going to get glued down. What you don't want is the end of those leads flopping around. That will cause a problem. So we're going to glue this joint. Now this cone is a little bit loose around this former, so we put this glue down. Some glue is going to work its way past it. It's going to work its way down there. So what we're going to end up doing is putting glue all the way around there, spraying the accelerator on top, and then I'm going to spray accelerator on the bottom because we don't want it to pool out on the bottom of the spider. Now because I was trying to do this quickly, I just made a good bead. It's going to be sufficient to hold the cone on. I didn't go over the leads just yet because I want to make sure I got to the bottom before it got messy. So I've done all that. I'm going to let this sit for a few minutes, make sure that it's nice and cured, and the accelerator will eventually evaporate all of the leftover stuff. If you have any of it, let's say on the cone here, and it hasn't evaporated, as soon as you go to put this glue down, it's going to hit it and it's going to harden. We don't necessarily want that around these spots. So I'm going to give this a little bit of dry time. Then I'll go back over, go over these leads just to make sure that those are glued down, everything's good. Then we'll proceed on to the next step. Now, down here on this neck, some glue did come out through the bottom, and I'm going to do another bead just to clean that up. Now that we're positive we've got a good glue joint on top and on bottom, it's not just cosmetic. We do want to make sure we've got a good joint here at the bottom. If the cone went all the way down to the spider, that would just kind of join the two there. But we had a slight gap, so it kind of fills it in. But we also make sure that we've got a good joint on there. So now we can flip it over, and we're going to get a nice glue joint right here at the bottom of the spider. But we also don't want to go above these holes that are the vents in the former. So we're going to be very careful with our bead here. And this is not one of those instances, but if you had to, make sure you put tape over these holes so you don't get it down in and onto the former, because that is bad. It was at this point that I made two mistakes while filming. First, gluing the spider and the surround down, I completely forgot to hit record. So I don't have any of that footage. CA glue is what is used on the spiders, and E6000, specifically black E6000, is used on the surround. I then soldered the leads to the terminals, and that's when I started getting footage. However, I didn't see that the battery for the microphone was actually dead, and there was no audio. So here we are, and this is basically what we've got going on. These are the trimmers that I used to clip the ends of it. You can use a side cutter as well if your basket will allow you to get in there. And you may even try going from the top through the surround, as you have not glued that down yet, or at least I haven't in this video. Quite often I would use clamps to hold the surround down to the basket, but this is one of those instances where I can take the gasket, it's going to push down on that surround and push it down to the basket, and that's going to hold it in place. The black glue does actually shrink a little bit, so that will hold it in place, and this is not a ton of power, won't generate a ton of pressure, so I'm not that worried about that much force on the surround in this case, so I just use the gasket. Now with everything in place, we've still got the dust cap. And to get this off the cone, all I did was take a razor, go to the bottom of the cone, cut it out down here, break it loose, and now we've got it to this point, and we've got to get this completely cleaned up. So I'm going to try to pull this off by hand, but there's a strong possibility that I'm gonna have to get a grinder on it. Now if I do that, I'm just gonna use a bench grinder, kind of move it around to get any of the glue off, that kind of thing. Whichever way you've got the means of doing, do that, but you want to make sure that you don't go through the material. This looks like it might be aluminum. It is actually plastic, so you can go through it pretty easily with anything very abrasive. But I'm gonna get this cleaned up, and then we'll get to actually taking the shim out and putting the dust cap on the sub. Now we've got the sub prepped for the dust cap, and here is the cap. I've got everything nice and clean. I did have to use the grinder on this one, so I just use a bench grinder, but anything you've got will work. You can see it's down right to the edge where it barely goes through, or not quite all the way through, all the way around. You want to make sure this is a nice smooth surface. It doesn't have to be exactly perfect. If you do damage this, remember, we don't have another one. So you gotta be real careful with that. So I've got nice clean surface to go to here. We've got clean surface on the cone here. Make sure you haven't accumulated any dust or anything like that on it. And now we're gonna get it straight. So what we can do from here, we're gonna use reference points. We've got terminals here, and we wanna make it so the wires come out the side, not the bottom. So we're gonna want the bottom of the logo here, the top of the logo here, which means we can put it on sideways here. We've got where it says audio that we wanna have lined up between here and here. And I'm just gonna eyeball that. But first I'm gonna get glue on here. And I'm doing that because I've got the ridge. I know exactly where it's going to drop in. I've got a very small surface here that I don't really want to put it on here and deal with it and then put it on. But I can just put it on here first. You can't necessarily do that if you don't have a ridge in the cone, but we do. So I'm going to use it. Now remember, again, we don't need an enormous amount of glue on here, as it will spread out when we push on, and we don't want it to come gobbing out. But I did notice that I missed one little spot right there. You want to make sure you get absolutely all of it, but you also don't want so much that it blows out the side or the top, which it might in some of these spots, but we should be in pretty good shape. So we're going to line this up exactly how we need it. We're going to line up the audio as a straight line and drop it in place. Now with the sub completely built, everything is dry, we can now put it on the bench and test it. Now there is a track that I use that goes over several different frequencies, does it in a dynamic way. I use that. You don't have to. You can simply play a bunch of different frequencies. One thing that you may find is sometimes you might get some kind of funny noise at a higher frequency where you don't at a lower frequency. Or you might get a different noise at a lower frequency and not a higher frequency. And that's why you don't just pick, like, say 30 hertz and check it, or just 60 hertz and check it. We want to have some dynamics to make sure that everything is completely good. So we're going to start this up, make sure that it doesn't make any funny noises, everything's moving okay, and then we should be good. Now you may have noticed, I turned up the volume, we got the definite maximum throw that we're gonna get out of this. And it started to sound just a little bit different, and that noise is coming from the spiders themselves. Right at max throw, they're getting to the point where they're actually starting to make a little pop noise where the ridges flatten out and then come back. So spider design can change how that is, but we are definitely maxing out the spider. We're definitely maxing out mechanical limits there, and we're all good. So everything is fine. This can be handed off to the customer, and I can feel good about it. If you like this video, check out some of the other sub build videos that we've done. in that playlist. Check out emfcaraudio.com for all of your car audio needs. We've got batteries, caps, subwoofers, amplifiers, mid-ranges. Make sure you hit subscribe and the notification bell so you get notified every time we do a new video. You can get exclusive content and deals if you're a member. So hit that join button next to subscribe and you can become a member for less than the price of 1 cup of coffee. And I'll see you again in another Tech Stuff Tuesday.